Tonight's story isn't about missiles or soldiers on a battlefield. It's about money, specifically the currency that controls the global oil trade. Imagine this scenario. Iran allows oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz only if the oil is paid for in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. At first glance, it may sound like a small policy shift, but in reality, it could challenge the decades-long dominance of the dollar in the global energy market. Nearly one-fifth of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow waterway. When that much oil flows through a single passage, the currency used to purchase it becomes a geopolitical issue, not just an economic one. Something changed in this war, and almost no one noticed it at first. It wasn't a missile strike, it wasn't a tanker explosion, it wasn't even a dramatic announcement from the Pentagon. The shift came from a single sentence quietly spoken by a senior Iranian official during a CNN interview on Friday, and that sentence might pose a bigger threat to the global financial system than any missile launched. In this conflict, the official said Iran is considering allowing oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, but under one condition: the oil must be paid for in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. Read that slowly again, because the significance may not hit immediately. The Strait of Hormuz carries nearly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. It is the most important energy choke point on Earth. For the past 14 days of this conflict, the United States military has been attempting and failing to fully reopen it. Tanker captains were even urged by Donald Trump to show courage and sail through the strait. Yet in practice, the passage remained effectively closed. Now, Iran is suddenly offering to reopen it, but the price is not a ceasefire. It isn't a political concession. The price is something far more unusual: a change in currency. And once you understand what that means, the stakes of this war begin to look very different. For more than half a century, the global oil market has followed one basic rule: oil is priced in US dollars. That rule began in 1974 when Saudi Arabia reached a historic agreement with Washington. Saudi oil would be sold exclusively in dollars, and in return the United States would guarantee military protection. Other oil-producing countries soon followed the same model. This arrangement created what became known as the Petrodollar system. It may sound technical, but it reshaped the entire global economy. Any country that wanted to buy oil first needed US dollars. That meant every country in the world had to maintain dollar reserves. Those reserves created constant global demand for the US currency. This demand allowed the United States to borrow money at lower costs. It allowed the country to run large deficits without collapsing its currency. It also enabled Washington to impose financial sanctions capable of crippling entire economies. The petrodollar was not just an economic agreement, it became the financial engine of American global power. It helped fund a U.S. military budget larger than the next 10 countries combined. It strengthened Washington's influence over global trade systems, and it helped make the dollar the backbone of the modern global economy. That system has been in place for 52 years. Now Iran is suggesting something that could weaken it. What makes the situation even more interesting is that Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily to challenge the system. It doesn't need regime change or a battlefield victory. It only needs to prove one thing: that oil can move through the world's most important energy choke point without using dollars. Once that precedent exists, the entire argument for dollar-only oil becomes weaker. In fact, something surprising has already been happening quietly behind the scenes. Since February 28, the first day of Operation Epic Fury, Iran has shipped more than 11 million barrels of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Every single barrel was sent to China. Every transaction was paid in yuan. Chinese tankers continued to move freely through the strait. They were not attacked. They were not blocked. Their shipments kept flowing while other tankers remained outside the passage. Insurance costs for those waiting tankers climbed. Cargo remained idle. Global markets watched nervously. In effect, two parallel systems began operating at the same time: yuan-based tankers moving through the strait and dollar-based tankers stuck outside. This quiet division has been happening for 2 weeks, which means Friday's statement from Iran wasn't really introducing a new threat. It was simply formalizing what had already been taking place and asking the world whether it wants to make that system permanent. Earlier this week, the United States bombed Karg Island, Iran's main oil export hub. The facility handles roughly 90% of the country's crude exports. Washington presented the strike as a demonstration of control, but Iran adapted within 48 hours. Tankers were redirected to the Jask terminal on the Gulf of Oman, located south of the Strait of Hormuz. This route allowed Iran to bypass the choke point entirely for its own exports. Yet the strait itself remained effectively closed for everyone else. In other words, the military target was hit, but the economic leverage survived. Iran's negotiating position remained unchanged. The strait opens when the currency changes. Suddenly, the conflict looks less like a traditional military confrontation and more like a financial turning point. Oil markets are already reacting, traders are beginning to consider a world where access to 20% of global oil supply requires payment in yuan, and somewhere in Beijing, long-term calculations made years ago may finally be paying off. China hasn't fired a single missile in this conflict. It hasn't deployed troops. Yet the situation may be advancing China's financial strategy. To understand why, it helps to examine how the petrodollar system works on a daily basis. When a European country buys oil from Saudi Arabia, it pays in dollars even if its own currency is the euro. When an Asian country buys oil from Iraq, it converts its currency into dollars first. When an African country imports oil, dollars are used again. For 52 years, this has been the operational rule of global energy trade. That rule forces countries to maintain large dollar reserves, reinforcing global demand for the U.S. currency. But imagine what happens if the Strait of Hormuz begins accepting yuan instead. Countries that rely on Gulf oil would start accumulating yuan reserves. Gradually, the operational demand for dollars would decline as demand decreases, pressure on the dollar increases, borrowing costs could rise, maintaining global military infrastructure could become more expensive. This matters because the United States currently maintains roughly 800 military bases around the world, a global defense network partially supported by the financial advantages of the dollar system. Another important detail often goes unnoticed. China has been developing an alternative international payment network for years, called CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. In 2025 alone, it processed transactions worth about $245 trillion in yuan-denominated trade. That represented a 43% increase from the previous year. In other words, the infrastructure for yuan-based global trade already exists. Iran's proposal could dramatically accelerate its adoption. China didn't start this war, but the conditions now favor its long-term strategy. For years, Beijing quietly purchased Iranian oil using yuan. It encouraged alternative payment systems and prepared for a moment like this. When the Strait of Hormuz became restricted, that preparation suddenly mattered. Chinese tankers kept moving while others waited. At the same time, another geopolitical twist emerged. The United States recently reversed its ban on Russian oil imports. Critics in Europe called the decision a gift to Vladimir Putin, but the reasoning was straightforward. Disruptions in Gulf supply were creating an energy shortage, and Washington needed alternative sources quickly. The country that America had tried to isolate suddenly became part of the energy equation again. In just 14 days, the geopolitical map of global oil has shifted dramatically. Iran continues to sell roughly 1.2 million barrels of oil per day to China. That's less than before the war, but still enough to generate revenue, fund military operations, and challenge the sanctions designed to restrict it. Gradually, the leverage the United States expected to have in this conflict is changing. The military campaign continues, but beneath it, the financial battlefield is shifting. Looking further ahead, the implications become even clearer. Imagine a Southeast Asian country that needs to import oil. Before this conflict, it had one main option: convert its currency into dollars, send those dollars to a Gulf producer, and receive the oil. But if yuan payments through Hormuz become normal, that country suddenly has another choice. It could convert its currency into yuan. Instead, use China's CIPS payment network rather than the SWIFT system and purchase discounted oil moving safely through the strait. Once such an option exists, it becomes difficult to remove. Countries rarely return to more expensive systems voluntarily. This may be why Washington appears to be racing against time. Every day yuan-denominated tankers pass through Hormuz, the precedent grows stronger. Every shipment demonstrates that the alternative system works. Every government that begins accumulating yuan reserves becomes slightly less dependent on the dollar. The petrodollar system is not collapsing overnight, but the countdown on its dominance may have begun. Meanwhile, another pressure point is emerging further south in the Red Sea. Houthi forces aligned with Iran have intensified attacks there. Shipping routes that bypass Hormuz are becoming increasingly dangerous. That means two of the world's most important trade corridors are under pressure at the same time. Strategic oil reserves can soften the shock temporarily, but they cannot permanently replace the reopening of these routes, and reopening them may require accepting new conditions no longer set solely in Washington. Officials in Washington continue to emphasize military statistics: missile stockpiles destroyed, drone production reduced, and tactical victories announced. But financial indicators are telling a different story. Yuan transactions are rising, Chinese oil imports are increasing, dollar-denominated tankers remain stuck outside Hormuz. Two different scoreboards are showing two very different results. The United States entered this conflict aiming to reinforce its dominance in the Middle East. 14 days later, the outcome looks far less certain. Iran's nuclear materials remain protected deep within mountains. Tankers continue to be targeted. The strait remains effectively closed to dollar-based trade, and China is quietly accumulating discounted energy supplies. The petrodollar system is now facing its most serious structural challenge in decades. Iran may not win the war militarily, but it may not need to. Every day the yuan for Hormuz condition remains in place. The global financial system shifts slightly. Bombs continue to fall. Military briefings continue. Headlines continue focusing on battlefield events. But behind all of that, something quieter may be unfolding. The currency used to purchase the world's most important commodity may be changing. The petrodollar system turned 52 years old on the day this war began, and Iran has now suggested how it might end, not with surrender, not with a final battle, but with a simple condition: at a narrow waterway, pay in yuan or wait outside the strait. Right now, the entire world is calculating its response. China likely made its decision years ago. If you found this analysis eye-opening, then you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Subscribe to Market Mindset so you don't miss the next deep analysis on global power, money, and the forces shaping the world economy. And if this video made you see the headlines differently, press the like button so more people can discover it. I'd also like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the petrodollar system can survive this shift, or are we witnessing the beginning of a completely new financial order? Share your perspective in the comments below. Often the most insightful observations come from the community itself.